The rain drummed against the windows of the Pine Valley shooting range as Margaret Sullivan pushed through the heavy glass doors. Her worn cardigan and faded jeans, a stark contrast to the tactical gear and expensive equipment on display. At 43, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and hands calloused from years of manual labor, she looked exactly like what she was, a small-town librarian who had never belonged in places where power and privilege congregated. The reception area gleamed with polished brass and mahogany, walls adorned with photographs of military units and law enforcement teams, all bearing the range's elite certification stamps. Behind the curved desk sat a young woman whose perfectly manicured nails clicked against her keyboard without looking up. "Excuse me," Margaret said softly, her voice barely audible above the distant crack of gunfire from the indoor ranges. "I'd like to register for today's Delta Force reunion demonstration." The receptionist's fingers froze, mid-type. Her eyes traveled up Margaret's modest frame, taking in the drugstore, reading glasses perched on her nose, the absence of any tactical branding, the nervousness in her stance. A smirk played at the corners of her mouth. "I think you're confused. Ma'am, the Delta reunion is a private event. Invitation only, for operators and their guests." The emphasis on operators carried the weight of 1,000 assumptions. Margaret fumbled in her canvas bag, producing a creased envelope. "I have an invitation. From Colonel James Mitchell." The receptionist's smirk deepened as she glanced at the envelope without touching it. "Perhaps you could wait in the viewing area? I'm sure someone will sort this out." Before Margaret could respond, the main doors burst open, admitting a group of men whose presence immediately dominated the space. They moved with the coordinated precision of those accustomed to operating as a unit, their civilian clothes unable to disguise the military bearing beneath. At their center walked Derek Stone, his silver hair cropped close, his blue eyes scanning the room with habitual, tactical assessment. The former Delta Force commander still carried himself like he owned every space he entered. And in many ways, it did. Pine Valley Range existed because of his connections, his reputation, his ability to transform military excellence into civilian profit. His gaze fell on Margaret, and something flickered across his features, not recognition, but dismissal so complete it might as well have been invisibility. "Gentlemen," Stone announced to his entourage, his voice carrying the authority of countless briefings in hostile territories, "welcome back to Pine Valley. 20 years since Operation Sandstorm, and here we are." The men responded with the easy camaraderie of shared secrets, shared dangers, shared triumphs. One of them, a thick-set man with scarred hands, noticed Margaret still standing by the desk. "Looks like we have an admirer." "Stone, one of those military wives who can't let go?" The group's laughter was neither cruel nor kind, it simply excluded her from relevance. Stone turned, his assessment of Margaret lasting less than 2 seconds. "Ma'am, this is a closed event. The public range is open tomorrow." Margaret's fingers tightened on her invitation. "Colonel Mitchell invited me. I'm here for the demonstration." Stone's expression shifted from dismissal to irritation. James Mitchell had been gone for 3 years, his death in a hiking accident, leaving questions that Stone had worked hard to bury. Why his former teammate would have invited this nobody to an event planned after his death made no sense. Unless, the thought flickered and died, crushed by the impossibility of it. Mitchell's estate might have sent out some old mailing list invitations by mistake. Stone said smoothly, "I'll have someone refund whatever fee you paid. Rodriguez, help this lady find the exit." But Margaret didn't move. Something in her posture had changed. Subtle but significant. The nervousness remained, but beneath it lay something else, determination forged in places Stone couldn't imagine. "I didn't pay any fee," she said quietly. "James sent this invitation personally. He said you'd honor it." The mention of Mitchell's first name, The implication of personal connection sent a ripple of unease through Stone's carefully maintained composure. He stepped closer, using his height advantage to intimidate. "Lady, I don't know what game you're playing, but James Mitchell is dead. Has been for 3 years. So unless you're claiming to commune with ghosts, I knew him before he died." Margaret interrupted, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He saved my life once. Said if I ever needed anything, to find you, that you'd understand about debts of honor." The room had gone quiet, the other Delta veterans watching with the heightened awareness of those who had survived by reading subtle currents of danger. Stone's jaw tightened. Mitchell had been notorious for his off-the-books activities, his tendency to help civilians in ways that complicated operations, but he'd also been the best operator Stone had ever known, which is why certain details about his death had been carefully managed. "What's your name?" Stone asked, his tone shifting from dismissive to cautiously hostile. "Margaret Sullivan." She paused, then added quietly, "But James knew me by another name. A long time ago." Stone studied her more carefully now, looking past the librarian facade to notice details he'd initially missed. The way she stood despite her apparent nervousness, weight balanced, unconsciously tactical, the scars on her hands that weren't from paper cuts, the way her eyes tracked movement in her peripheral vision while maintaining eye contact. "Impossible," he breathed, the word escaping before he could stop it, because the person he was thinking of had been dead for 20 years, killed in an operation so classified that most of the documentation had been destroyed, an operation that had made his career while destroying others. "You have me confused with someone else?" Margaret said softly. "I'm just a librarian who knew James Mitchell, who promised him I'd come if invited. May I stay?" The question hung in the air like an unexploded ordnance. Stone's mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. If she was who he suspected, but no. That person was dead. He'd seen the reports, had built his reputation on the success of that mission, yet Mitchell had always asked questions, had never quite accepted the official story. And now, 3 years after his conveniently timed death, this woman appeared with his invitation to an event Mitchell couldn't have known about when alive. "Fine," Stone said abruptly. "You can observe from the visitors section, but this is an active range with live ammunition. You'll need to sign extensive waivers. Any disruption, any problems, and security will remove you immediately." He turned to the receptionist. "Process her paperwork. Full liability coverage." As Margaret signed the documents, Stone gathered his team, his voice low and urgent. "Change of plans? We're modifying today's demonstration." Rodriguez frowned. "Why?" "Everything's set up for the standard. Because I said so." Stone cut him off. "We're going to remind everyone why Delta remains elite. Full tactical demonstration. Live fire decision drills. Maximum complexity." He glanced toward Margaret, who was methodically reading every line of the waiver. "If someone wants to play games with Mitchell's ghost, let's show them what real operators can do." What Stone didn't notice was the slight smile that crossed Margaret's face as she signed the final page. She'd spent 20 years becoming invisible, building a life so ordinary that no one would ever connect Margaret Sullivan, the small-town librarian, with the person she'd been before. But promises to the dead carried weight, and James Mitchell had been very specific in his posthumous instructions. They need to know the truth. His letter had said, about Operation Sandstorm, about what really happened to Echo 7, about why I could never let it go. The invitation had been the key. Time to arrive for an event Mitchell had somehow known would occur after his death. Margaret suspected he'd known more about his upcoming accident than anyone realized. The visitors section was a glassed-in observation area overlooking the main range, elevated to provide clear sight lines while protecting observers from any possibility of ricochet or accident. Margaret settled into a corner seat, unconsciously choosing a position that gave her maximum visibility while minimizing others' ability to approach unseen. Around here, a handful of other observers chatted quietly, mostly wives and girlfriends of the Delta veterans. A few reporters with special access, some VIP guests from the defense contracting world. She recognized the type from a lifetime ago, people who profited from proximity to violence without ever risking themselves. The range below had been configured into an elaborate tactical course, pop-up targets, variable lighting, obstacles that would force shooters to fire from unconventional positions. Stone stood at the central control station, wireless microphone attached to his collar. Every inch the master of ceremonies. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice boomed through the speakers. What you're about to witness represents 20 years of evolution in tactical shooting. When we executed Operation Sandstorm in 2003, we revolutionized how special operations approach high-value target elimination. Margaret's hands tightened imperceptibly on her bag. Sandstorm, the mission that had changed everything, that had ended with 7 operators dead, and Stone emerging as the sole survivor hero, the mission where Echo Savina's support element, whose very existence had been erased from official records, had been sacrificed to ensure success. Today's demonstration will recreate key elements of that operation. Stone continued, showing how superior training and tactical innovation overcome any obstacle. The other Delta veterans took their positions, weapons at ready. Even 20 years later, their movements showed the fluid competence of elite training. Margaret watched them with the critical eye of someone who had once moved in their world, noting strengths and weaknesses, patterns and preferences. Then Stone did something unexpected. He looked directly at the observation window, his gaze finding Margaret with unerring accuracy. But first, let's address the elephant in the room. We have a special guest today, someone who claims connection to our fallen brother James Mitchell. The other observers turned to look at Margaret, curiosity and speculation in their expressions. She remained still, giving nothing away. James always said that true warriors could be found in unexpected places. Stone continued, his tone carrying subtle mockery. That skill with a weapon wasn't limited to those who wore uniforms. So in his honor, let's extend an invitation. Mrs. Sullivan, would you care to join us on the range? Show us what James Mitchell saw in you? The challenge was obvious, designed to humiliate. A middle-aged librarian against Delta Force veterans in their element. Margaret could refuse. Maintain her cover. Observe whatever demonstration Stone had planned. But that wasn't why she'd come. Slowly, she stood. I'll need to borrow equipment, she said, her voice carrying clearly through the intercom system. The observation room erupted in whispers. Below, the Delta veterans exchanged glances of amusement and disbelief. Stone's smile was sharp as a blade. Of course, Rodriguez will assist you. Standard safety briefing required. As Margaret made her way down to the range floor, she heard one of the wives whisper, "Is she insane? She's going to get hurt?" But Margaret had been hurt before, in ways these people couldn't imagine. What waited below was just another kind of reckoning. 120 years in the making. Rodriguez met her at the range entrance, his expression professionally neutral, despite the situation's absurdity. "Ma'am, I need to verify your firearms experience for insurance purposes. I've handled weapons," Margaret said simply, "a long time ago." Rodriguez led her to the equipment room, walls lined with every conceivable type of firearm. "What's your preference? Pistol? Rifle? Given the tactical course, most people choose that one," Margaret interrupted, pointing to a case in the corner. Rodriguez followed her gaze and frowned. "That's a precision rifle. Bolt action. Completely wrong for a tactical course. You'd need a semi-automatic. James Mitchell taught me that the weapon doesn't make the warrior," Margaret said quietly. "That rifle. Please." Rodriguez shrugged and retrieved the weapon. a military-grade bolt-action rifle with advanced optics. As he handed it over, Margaret's entire demeanor shifted subtly. Her hands moved over the weapon with unconscious familiarity. Checking balance. Action. Traeger pull. She removed the scope without hesitation. Ma'am, you'll need the optics for accurate. Not for what I have in mind, Margaret said. Rodriguez watched in growing confusion as she made minute adjustments to the iron sights. Everything about her movements suggested extensive training, yet nothing in her appearance supported that conclusion. Safety briefing, he said automatically. Range rules state, treat every weapon as loaded. Never point at anything you don't intend to destroy. Finger off trigger until ready to fire. Know your target and what's beyond. Margaret recited. I remember, back on the main range, Stone waited with poorly concealed anticipation. The tactical course was designed for modern combat techniques, rapid target acquisition, multiple angles, speed over precision. A bolt-action rifle would be almost impossible to use effectively, especially for a civilian. He'd given her rope to hang herself with, and she'd tied the noose. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, Mrs. Sullivan has chosen an interesting weapon for our tactical course. For comparison, my team will run the course first with proper equipment. The demonstration that followed was undeniably impressive. The Delta veterans moved through the course with practiced efficiency, engaging targets with rapid fire, using cover effectively. Displaying the muscle memory of thousands of hours of training, their scores appeared on overhead display shy percentages, fast times, technical excellence. Then it was Margaret's turn. She stood at the starting position, rifle held in a stance that looked almost archaic compared to the modern techniques just displayed. Stone provided commentary with false concern. Note the bolt-action rifle, requiring manual cycling between shots, the lack of optical sights, the static shooting position. Misses. Sullivan appears to be using techniques from a bygone era. The buzzer sounded. What happened next defied conventional understanding of marksmanship. Margaret didn't move through the course. She anchored herself in a single position, her body rotating with mechanical precision. The bolt action cycled with impossible speed, her movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. But it wasn't the speed that silenced the room. It was the targets. Each shot didn't simply hit, it struck, with surgical precision in spots that shouldn't have been visible from her position. She was shooting through gaps in cover, using angles that seemed geometrically impossible. And then, on the seventh target, she did something that made Stone's blood run cold. The target was completely obscured, hidden behind double barriers. Margaret fired at the polished brass of a display piece mounted on the wall. The bullet ricocheted at a precise angle, threading through an inch-wide gap to strike the hidden target's center, a shot that required not just skill, but mathematical certainty of angles and velocities. A technique he'd seen only once before, 20 years ago, demonstrated by someone whose death had made his career. The range fell silent. The scoreboard showed something unprecedented: perfect hits on every target, achieved through methods that violated every principle of modern tactical shooting. Margaret carefully safed the rifle and set it down. When she looked up at Stone, her expression had changed completely. Gone was the nervous librarian. In her place stood someone who had once been Delta Force's most classified asset, someone whose unique abilities had been deemed too valuable and too dangerous to acknowledge publicly. "Hello? Derek," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. "We need to talk about Operation Sandstorm, about what really happened to Echo 7, and about why James Mitchell had to die." The words landed like artillery shells. Around the range, the other veterans shifted uneasily, recognizing the weight of accusations being unveiled. Stone's face had gone pale, his carefully constructed world beginning to fracture. "Range is closed," he barked suddenly. Everyone out except core team. The observers were hustled away. Protests ignored. Within minutes, only the Delta veterans remained, forming a loose circle around Margaret and Stone. The atmosphere had shifted from demonstration to interrogation. "You're dead," Stone said flatly. "Sarah Chen died in Zandstorm. I saw the body." Margaret smiled sadly. "You saw a body. Burned beyond recognition. Wearing my tags. One of the local assets who'd been compromised. I was already gone. Extracted by Mitchell, against your direct orders." The implications rippled through the room. Rodriguez stepped forward. "Boss, what's she talking about? Echo 7 was killed when their position was overrun. Echo 7 was sacrificed." Margaret interrupted, deliberately exposed to draw enemy fire while Stone's team completed the primary mission. 7 operators died, so 1 man could claim glory. Stone's hand moved toward his concealed carry holster, then stopped as he noticed Margaret's subtle positioning. Even unarmed. She'd placed herself where she could reach cover and potentially disarm the closest man before anyone could draw. "You were never supposed to exist," Stone said quietly. "A female operator embedded with Delta? The Pentagon would have shut us down. Your entire presence was off books. Illegal, which made it convenient when you needed someone to blame for the intelligence failure." Margaret replied, "Dead women tell no tales?" Especially when they never officially existed. She reached into her bag slowly, producing a thick envelope. "But James Mitchell was a good man. He couldn't live with what happened. He spent 20 years gathering evidence, protecting me." Preparing for this moment, the other veterans were looking at Stone now, doubt creeping into their expressions. They'd all benefited from Sandstorm's success, from the reputation it had brought their unit. But they were also men who valued honor above glory. If Stone had sacrificed fellow operators for personal gain, Rodriguez was the first to speak. "The intelligence failure? Command said Echo 7 had bad intel. Led us into an ambush." Margaret shook her head. "The intel was good. Stone changed the plan on-site, sent us to draw fire while he took a safer route. When I tried to abort, he cut our communications. By the time Mitchell realized what was happening, it was too late." "Prove it?" Stone snarled, but sweat had broken out on his forehead. Margaret withdrew a small device from the Envelopia military-grade recording unit, scarred by fire but intact. Echo 7 recorded everything. Standard procedure for intelligence gathering units. This survived the fire. She pressed play. Stone's voice, 20 years younger but unmistakable, filled the range. "Echo 7. Adjust position to grid reference follows. I don't care what the imagery shows. You follow my orders, Mitchell. You keep your mouth shut, or you'll join them." The recording continued, each word damning. Orders that sent 7 operators to their deaths. Threats against Mitchell for protesting. And finally, Stone's cold calculation. 7 casualties from an intelligence failure looks better than 20 from a frontal assault. Echo 7 was always expendable. The circle of veterans had widened, unconsciously distancing themselves from Stone. These were men who had risked everything for each other, who lived by codes of loyalty that civilians couldn't understand. The revelation that one of their own had violated that sacred trust was shattering. It was war. Stone said desperately. Hard choices had to be made. The primary target was eliminated. The mission succeeded. My husband was one of those 7. Margaret said quietly. David Chen, a good man who trusted you to lead him, who died believing his sacrifice meant something. Her control finally cracked. 20 years of suppressed grief bleeding through. I vanished, became someone else. Tried to forget, but Mitchell found me, told me you'd built an empire on their graves. This range, your security company, all funded by defense contracts you got as Sandstorm's hero. Rodriguez had drawn his weapon, but it wasn't pointed at Margaret. "Boss, tell me she's lying." Tell me we didn't leave our own to die. Stone's mask finally shattered completely. The legendary operator replaced by a cornered animal. You don't understand. Command wanted results. My way saved lives or lives. The mission failed. Margaret interrupted. The man you killed wasn't the primary target. Just a double. The real target escaped. Went on to kill hundreds more. I had the right intel. But you didn't trust a woman's judgment. The revelation was the final blow. Not only had Stone sacrificed his own people, but he'd done it for nothing. The glorious victory that had built his legend was a lie built on lies. In the silence that followed, one of the veterans spoke. Murphy, the team's sniper. I remember that day. You said Echo 7 broke radio discipline. I gave away their position. I believed you. Another added, we all did. Made sense at the time. But Mitchell never did. Always asked questions. Stone made one last disparate play. She's lying. This is some elaborate condale. Mitchell's dead. He can't verify any of this. The recording could be faked. Then let's verify it another way. Margaret said. She moved to the equipment rack. Selected another rifle. This time, she didn't remove the scope. 20 years ago, I held the long-distance accuracy record for Delta Force. Unofficial. Of course, woman didn't exist in combat roles, but the shot I made in training was never equaled. 347 meters. Moving target. She looked at Stone. You were there? You saw it. Denied it happened. But you saw it. The veterans exchanged glances. The distance she'd named was at the extreme edge of possible, requiring perfect conditions and extraordinary skill. Stone had indeed claimed such a record once, but the shooter's identity had been mysteriously classified. Set it up, Rodriguez said quietly. Maximum range. Let's see. What followed was a masterclass in precision shooting. Margaret didn't just make the shot, she replicated it exactly 3 times. Each bullet passing through the same hole. It was marksmanship that transcended skill, entering the realm of art. When she finished, she set down the rifle and faced them all. I didn't come here for revenge. Stone will face justice. But that's for courts to decide. I came because James Mitchell asked me to, because the families of Echo 7 deserve the truth, because good men like David shouldn't be forgotten. Their sacrifice shouldn't be perverted into someone else's glory. She pulled out a second lager envelope, copies of everything, Mitchell's investigation, financial records showing how Stone profited from Sandstorm, testimonies from other operators who suspected the truth. It goes to DOD, congressional oversight, and the press tomorrow morning. Stone lunged then, desperation overcoming judgment. But 20 years of soft living had slowed him. While Margaret's reflexes remained sharp, she sidestepped, using his momentum against him, and he crashed into the equipment rack. Before he could recover, Rodriguez and Murphy had restrained him. It's over, boss, Rodriguez said sadly. Should have been over 20 years ago. As police sirens wailed in the distance, someone had called during the confrontation. Margaret gathered her belongings. The nervous librarian persona had been completely discarded, but neither had she returned to being Sarah Chen. She was something new. Someone who had survived the worst betrayal and emerged, not bitter, but determined that truth would prevail. What will you do now? Murphy asked her. Margaret considered the question. Go back to my library. Help kids learn to read. Live the quiet life David would have wanted. She paused at the door. But first, I have 6 more families to visit. They deserve to hear the truth from someone who was there. As she walked away, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of light through the range's high windows. Dust motes danced in the beams like ghosts finally given permission to rest. Behind her, Derek Stone sat in handcuffs, his empire crumbling, his legend revealed as murder dressed in glory. The truth, as James Mitchell had known, as Margaret had demonstrated, didn't need force or fury to prevail. Sometimes all it needed was one person with the courage to stand up, to speak out, to show that real strength wasn't about who could shoot fastest or claim the most kills. Real strength was in honoring the fallen, by ensuring their sacrifice was remembered honestly. It was in choosing justice over revenge, truth over comfortable lies. As Margaret Sullivan drove away from Pine Valley Range, she thought about David, about James, about all those who had paid the price for one man's ambition. She had kept her promise to the living and the dead. Now, finally, she could let them rest. The news broke like thunder across a clear sky. Within hours of Margaret's visit to Pine Valley Range, every major network carried the story. Delta Force scandal. Hero's legend built on betrayal, screamed headlines. Cable news panels erupted with former military analysts, some defending Stone, others condemning the betrayal of sacred brotherhood. Margaret watched from her modest apartment above the town library, knowing her anonymity would soon evaporate. She had prepared for this, had spent weeks arranging her affairs, ensuring the library would continue without her when the media storm hit. The first journalist arrived at dawn, somehow having connected Margaret Sullivan, the librarian, to the mysterious woman in the range footage. Behind him, a stream of others followed. Margaret met them at the library entrance, her appearance deliberately plain, her manner calm. "I'll make one statement," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had silenced the range. "Then I'm asking you to leave this town alone. These people didn't ask for this." The cameras rolled as she spoke. 20 years ago, 7 brave operators died because one man valued his career over their lives. Their families were told they died as heroes. And that much was true. They were heroes. But they didn't die from enemy action or intelligence failures. They died from betrayal. She held up a photograph. Echo 7 team. Faces young and confident. Taken days before Sandstorm. David Chen, Marcus Williams, Antonio Vasquez, Robert McKenna, Jason Park, William Foster, Samuel Okafor. Remember their names. Honor their sacrifice. Demand justice for their families. When pressed for details about her own identity, her training, her survival, Margaret simply said, "I was someone who loved a brave man and lost him to another man's ambition. Everything else is in the evidence already released." Then she turned and walked back into the library, closing the door on the clamoring reporters. Inside, the children's reading group waited, 7-year-olds clutching picture books, eyes wide with confusion at the commotion outside. Margaret smiled, settling into her familiar chair. Now, where were we? Ah, yes. The brave little mouse who stood up to the lion. As she read, her voice steady and warm, she thought about cycles of courage, about how even the smallest acts of standing up for truth could echo through generations. The children listened, rapt, unaware their librarian had just toppled a legend. The Pentagon's response was swift and devastating. By noon, Stone's military records were under review, his security clearances revoked, his company's government contracts suspended pending investigation. Rodriguez, who had immediately come forward to corroborate Margaret's account, led a group of Delta veterans in demanding a full inquiry. "We believed in a lie," he told investigators. "Every commendation, every honor Stone received was built on the graves of better men. We want the record corrected. We want Echo 7 recognized for their sacrifice." The investigation that followed revealed the depths of Stone's deception. Financial records showed millions in defense contracts awarded based on his Sandstorm reputation. Speaking fees, book deals, consulting arrangements, all predicated on a heroism that masked murder. But it was the personal testimonies that proved most damaging. Other operators came forward, admitting they'd harbored doubts about that night, but had been silenced by Stone's influence. by the culture of not questioning successful missions. Murphy, the sniper, revealed that Stone had threatened to end his career when he'd questioned the Echo 7 intelligence failure. He said, doubting. The official story was doubting Delta itself. That I was being disloyal to the unit. I was young. I stayed quiet. I've regretted it every day since the families of Echo 7, suddenly thrust into a nightmare of revised history, struggled with the revelations. Some had built 2 decades of meaning around their loved one's heroic sacrifice. Learning it had been unnecessary, preventable. Deliberate, the grief renewed itself with interest. Maria Chen, David's sister, flew in from California to meet Margaret. They sat in the library's quiet back room. 2 women bound by loss and lies. He wrote about you, Maria said, producing letters David had sent home. Said he'd found someone who could shoot the wings off a fly at 1,000 yards. Said you made him want to be better, to live up to the standard you set. Margaret held the letters with trembling hands. 20 years of suppressed memories flooding back. David's handwriting, his terrible jokes, his dreams of opening a shooting school after his service, of teaching kids discipline and respect through marksmanship, all ended by one man's decision in a dark desert night. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Maria asked, not accusingly, but with genuine curiosity. Margaret's answer was complex, layered with survivor's guilt and the brutal realities of being a classified asset. I didn't exist. Officially. No records. No proof. Stone made sure of that. And I was broken. Maria. Losing David. Losing the team. Barely escaping myself. I couldn't fight then. It took me years to even function again. She explained how Mitchell had found her, working multiple jobs under her assumed name, trying to disappear into anonymity. How he'd slowly convinced her that the truth mattered, that the families deserved to know, how he'd spent years building an unassailable case. Knowing Stone's influence made anything less than overwhelming evidence useless. Then James died. Margaret continued. His accident came just weeks after he told me he was ready to go public, but he was smarter than Stone realized. He'd already set everything in motion, including that invitation. He knew I'd come, knew I couldn't let their sacrifice be forgotten. The 2 women grieved together, sharing stories of David, finding solace in shared memory. When Maria left, she carried copies of the evidence Margaret had preserved, determined to ensure her brother's true story was told. The legal proceedings moved with unusual speed. Stone's lawyer attempted to claim the evidence was fabricated, that Margaret was a delusional woman seeking attention. That defense crumbled when the FBI's forensics team verified the recording's authenticity, when financial experts traced the money trails, when more veterans came forward with corroborating details. The turning point came when General Patricia Hayes, now retired but formerly high in Delta Force Command, revealed she'd suspected the truth for years. There were inconsistencies in Stone's report that troubled me, she testified, but he was the golden boy, the success story we needed. I let politics override my instincts. That's on me. She produced classified documents showing that the actual target of Operation Sandstorm had indeed escaped, had gone on to orchestrate 3 major terrorist attacks. If we'd listened to Echo 7's intelligence, if Stone hadn't changed the plan for his own glory, hundreds of lives could have been saved. The failure wasn't just more elite, was operational. Stone's trial became a sensation, not just for the military community, but for anyone who'd ever seen power corrupt justice. Each day brought new revelations, each worse than the last. Stone had falsified after-action reports. He'd threatened witnesses. He'd diverted funds meant for Echo 7's families into his own accounts. Margaret testified only once, her appearance creating a packed courtroom. She spoke simply, without drama, letting facts carry the weight of condemnation. When Stone's lawyer tried to attack her credibility, suggesting she was bitter about being forced out of the military. She responded with devastating precision. "I wasn't forced out. I chose to leave because I couldn't serve alongside someone who would murder his own men for a promotion. My only regret is that it took 20 years for the truth to surface." The lawyer pressed, trying to paint her as a woman scorned, perhaps romantically rejected by Stone. Margaret's response silenced the courtroom. "Mr. Stone wasn't worth my romantic interest then or now. But David Chen was, and Marcus Williams, and every member of Echo 7. They were worth everything. That's why I'm here." When the verdict came guilty on all counts, from negligent homicide to fraud, the courtroom erupted. Families of Echo 7 wept. Veterans stood in salute to their fallen brothers. And somewhere in the back row, James Mitchell's widow nodded with grim satisfaction. Her husband had been right to trust Margaret. Right to believe justice delayed wasn't justice denied. Stone received 40 years. His medals stripped. His name struck from honor rolls. But for Margaret, the legal victory felt hollow compared to what came next. The Department of Defense, in an unprecedented move, held a formal ceremony to properly honor Echo 7. Their names were added to the Delta Force Memorial. Their families presented with the medals they should have received 20 years ago. Margaret stood with the families, no longer hiding. As the Secretary of Defense read each name, each service record, each act of valor that had been erased by Stone's lies, these 7 operators represent the best of American military service. The Secretary said, they followed orders, trusted their leadership, and paid the ultimate price. That their sacrifice was perverted by one man's ambition makes their honor no less, their courage no smaller. Today, we restore their rightful place in history. After the ceremony, Margaret found herself surrounded by young soldiers, particularly female operators who'd broken barriers she'd once faced alone. "You were the first," one said, eyes bright with hero worship. "The first woman to qualify for Delta selection, even if it was off the books." Margaret shook her head. "I was a good shooter who loved a good man. That's all. The real heroes are those who serve openly, who break barriers in the light where everyone can see. I hid. You stand proud. That's the difference." But they pressed, wanting to know about her training, her techniques, the shot that had revealed her identity at Pine Valley. Margaret finally agreed to a single demonstration at Fort Bragg, closed to media but open to active special operations personnel, using the same rifle model she'd carried 20 years ago. She put on a shooting display that left even seasoned snipers speechless. Every shot deliberate, every angle calculated, a precision that transcended mere marksmanship and entered the realm of art. When she finished, she turned to the assembled operators. "This skill came with a price. Everything I lost. Everyone who died. 20 years of hiding who I was. You want to honor that? Be better than we were. Trust your people. All of them, regardless of gender or background. And never, ever, let ambition override honor." The ripple effects continued for months. Stone's conviction led to reviews of other operations, other suspiciously perfect missions. 2 more cases of sacrificed units came to light. Stone's protege following his playbook. The military justice system, embarrassed by the revelations, instituted new oversight procedures, new protections for classified personnel. The families of Echo 7 formed a foundation in their names, providing support for special operations families. Margaret quietly donated her military death benefit shelled in escrow for 20 years to fund its operations. Rodriguez, promoted to lead training at Pine Valley under new management, instituted the Echo 7 Memorial Match, where shooters competed not for glory but to raise money for the foundation. Margaret attended the first match, shooting under her real name for the first time in 20 years. She won, of course, donating the prize money back to the foundation. As she prepared to leave, returning to her quiet library life, Rodriguez stopped her. "Stay," he said simply. "Teach. Your skills. Your integrity, we need that. The community needs that." Margaret considered it, looking around at the young faces eager to learn. Part-time, she finally agreed. "Weekends only. I have a library to run." And so Margaret Sullivan, once Sarah Chen, once Echo, Seven's intelligence specialist, found a balance between her lives. Weekdays, she remained the town librarian, helping children discover worlds through books. Weekends, she taught at Pine Valley, passing on skills that transcended marksmanship lessons about integrity, about standing up for truth, about the weight of taking a life and the heavier weight of letting others die through inaction. The media eventually moved on to other scandals, other revelations. Stone faded into imprisoned obscurity, his legend thoroughly destroyed. The families of Echo 7 found peace in truth, even painful truth, rather than comfortable lies. But in a small-town library, children still gathered for story time, unaware their librarian had lived the kind of story they read about in books. Margaret preferred it that way. Heroes, she'd learned, weren't made by medals or missions or impossible shots. They were made in quiet moments of choosing right over easy, truth over comfort, justice over revenge. As she closed the library one evening, Margaret paused at the memorial she'd installed a simple plaque with 7 names and a quote from James Mitchell, "Truth is the highest honor we can give the fallen." She touched it gently, whispered goodnight to ghosts finally at rest, and headed home. Tomorrow, there would be more stories to tell, more children to inspire, more truth to preserve. The mirror-reflected shot that had amazed Delta Force had been spectacular, but it wasn't her greatest achievement. That came in the quiet courage of speaking truth to power, and of honoring the dead by ensuring their stories were told honestly, completely, with all the messy humanity intact. Some shots echo in rifle ranges, others echo through history. Margaret Sullivan had made both kinds, and finally, she was at peace with the shooter she'd been and the teacher she'd become.